Much of Eastern Europe, which once used to be part of the Soviet Union, has now joined NATO, and this happened despite Russia's protests and warnings. The last reasonably friendly warning from Moscow came in the year 2007. Vladimir Putin addressed the annual Munich conference, where he said, and I'm quoting, "NATO has put its frontline forces on our borders. This expansion represents a serious provocation that reduces the level of mutual trust, and we have the right to ask against whom is this expansion intended and what happened to the assurances our Western partners made after the dissolution of the Warsaw Pact."
I think he needs F-16s now.
No, he doesn't need F-16s now. There is no basis upon which there is a rationale, according to our military now, to provide F-16s.
But you're not ruling it out.
I am ruling it out for now.
June 1997, 50 prominent foreign policy experts signed an open letter to President Bill Clinton calling America's efforts to expand NATO a policy error of historic proportions. Then we have George Kennan, the father of America's containment policy during the Cold War. He too called NATO expansion a tragic mistake with no reason whatsoever. The warnings went on for decades. In 2008, William J. Burns, the US ambassador to Moscow, wrote a letter to the State Department where he said that Ukrainian entry into NATO is the brightest of all red lines for the Russian elite. He said that even Putin's sharpest critics at home consider Ukraine's entry a direct challenge to Russian interests. It does not end there. This is Robert M. Gates. He was the defense secretary in the Bush and Obama administrations. He wrote in his memoir that trying to bring Georgia and Ukraine into NATO was truly overreaching. Then we have Strobe Talbot, a former Deputy Secretary of State. He described the Russian perception in a similar way, how they consider NATO as a vestige of the Cold War, and point out that if the Warsaw Pact was disbanded, why did the West not dismantle NATO? So several voices in the Western world had warned that Russia's protests have merit and that NATO expansion could spell serious trouble. Yet, successive American administrations paid no heed to these warnings. They kept widening NATO's security umbrella.
We're confident that the Chinese leadership is considering the provision of lethal equipment. We also don't see that a final decision has been made yet.
Then they stated that each country is free to choose alliances, but in doing so, no country can strive to strengthen its security at the expense of the security of others. And then another principle was signed by the presidents and the prime ministers, according to which no country and no organization in the OSCE region can pretend to dominate militarily. If you read it again, it's clear that NATO violated all these commitments. By the way, it was in 1999, and then it was repeated in 2010 at another OSCE summit in Kazakhstan.
It takes a process to even say that. Some people would say, well, he didn't say much. But for the CIA director to say that publicly takes a process. Why?
This is part of a strategy. It's like an actual policy and strategy by this White House to use intelligence, to declassify it, to release it publicly in order to affect the decisions of adversaries. So in this case, it's designed to deter China. It's also designed to make sure that the Europeans are on side about the threat that China poses and the threat that China and Russia pose together. So I think it's going to be very effective. When Biden said this weekend, look, I don't really think that they're going to follow through with this, I agree with that, because now that it's out there and it's called, it makes it really hard for China to do this because they need the US and Europe economically.
We have
even more difficult. So where does this take us?
Yeah. Tell me, when this conference started? What year?
This is the eighth President dialogue we are having.
8 years.
Eighth, yeah.
You started in 2014 or something?
Yeah, something. Yeah.
Have you been interested during these years what is going on in Iraq, what is going on in Afghanistan? Have you been asking the United States and NATO whether they are certain of what they're doing? when they now Scholz, Baerbock, Macron and others say this is the first time when the OSCE Helsinki Final Act is being violated. They don't remember about 1999 when Serbia was bombed, when Joe Biden, being a senator at the time, he was bragging that 1 year before the bombing of Serbia, I promoted this approach. And I believe that we have to bomb them out into peace. When Iraq was ruined as a state, after Colin Powell showed a vial with some powder, and then a few years later Tony Blair said, yes, it was a mistake, what to do?
No, but that is a lesson which needs to be learned.
Wait a second. If you believe that the United States has the right to declare a threat to its national interest any place on earth, like they did in Yugoslavia, in Iraq, in Libya, in Syria, 10,000 miles across the Atlantic Ocean, and they have the right to do so, and you don't ask them any questions. And Russia, not just overnight, like they did in Iraq and elsewhere, but for more than 10 years, warning them, guys, you are doing something which is going to be very bad.
But I think the question has been asked.
One second. Not across the ocean, but just on our borders, on the territories where the Russians lived for centuries and centuries and centuries. So, if it is not a double standard, then I'm not a minister, you know.
In internal politics, Vladimir Putin gives this interview over the weekend. Listen to this. Number one, it's dated, if you will. It's a fantasy of how the world is today. But what does he mean by this?
They have one goal, to break up the former Soviet Union in its main part, the Russian Federation. And then, perhaps, they will accept us in the so-called family of civilized peoples. But only separately, each part separately. Moreover, in today's conditions, when all the leading NATO countries have declared their main goal to inflict a strategic defeat on us so that our people suffer, how can we, under these conditions, not take into account their nuclear potentials?
Two things jumped out at me. You're way smarter than me when it comes to how he thinks, so help me. Number one, the nuclear potentials. He waves that flag when he feels it's in his interest that, well, they have nuclear weapons and they don't like us. But they have one goal, to break up the former Soviet Union and its main part. The Soviet Union has been broken up for a long time. At least he used the word former. What is he trying to communicate to the people at home then?
He's trying to communicate what the Russians call strategic depth, which means that he's got this alliance of former Soviet states, including like Central Asia, that he has under his thumb. And he needs to keep those. And right now, this week, Secretary Blinken is headed to Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan, those core parts of this former Soviet Union that we're trying to break away. So, yeah, it's kind of true. But that doesn't mean that that's not the way the world should work.